There we go. And we had been kind of in the middle of the steps that are required for a microbe to cause disease in a person. And kind of to back up and review, you have to be exposed to the microbe and have it enter the body at the correct portal of entry. And then once it is at the correct portal of entry, it has to adhere to your cells and not get washed away. And then it has to get deeper into the body. So it has to invade the tissues. And here we see an example of a bacterium burrowing through stomach mucus and getting into stomach lining cells. And this is the cause of stomach ulcers. So they have to get deep into the body, and they also have to avoid the immune system. And we'll see some examples of proteins that help them do that coming up. And once they get to this point, we would say that the microbe has colonized. So after this point, we would say that they have colonized the host, or sometimes we call that infected. They have set up residence and they have moved into us, and they will now be staying with us for some amount of time once they've invaded. So at this point, the microbe has infected us, and it's going to now multiply. The length of time that it multiplies and whether it does damage, that's going to vary between microbes. But once it's kind of hidden from the immune system and gotten deep into our tissues, we now have an infection or a colonization. And once that has happened, we can describe infections in a variety of ways. So the first type of infection that I want to describe is one that doesn't harm you. One that you never feel, you never have symptoms. And we would call that asymptomatic. Asymptomatic. There are no symptoms, no signs, no damage. But the person is infected, or let's say the person is colonized. The microbe is living in them and it's growing in them, but it's not causing any problem right now. We call that asymptomatic. And if a person has an asymptomatic infection, there are kind of two reasons why that might be. So it could be that the pathogen is never dangerous, or let's say the microbe is not ever going to be dangerous. And it's just kind of living with us in a non-damaging way. And we would call that set of microbes microbial flora. And was today the day you're supposed to watch videos? Yeah. We'll kind of, I won't get to flora very much today, but there are lots and lots of microbes that technically grow in us and colonize us and cause no damage, and sometimes they even help. Those are the microbial flora. The other option is that you are not experiencing any symptoms yet, but maybe the microbe is in a latent state and it's not causing you problems right now, but the damage is going to come later. either of those conditions could cause a person to technically be colonized but not feel anything right now. And the person could be asymptomatic. So that's one type of infection. Another way that we could describe infections is you have the infection in a particular location. We say that we have the infection in a limited area. And we call that a local infection. Let's say that the microbe stays in a limited area. We call that local infection. And a lot of times these are skin infections that don't go any further than that. Or say that you have strep throat, strep pyogenes infecting your throat, and it just stays there and it doesn't move anywhere else. And that was a local infection. It's possible that a local infection could actually move elsewhere and cause a location at a second place. And that has a different definition, and we call that focal. So a focal, we'll write the word here, focal. But the definition of that is when the microbe moves from first location to a second different area. Call that focal infection. Should have drawn the first one in the throat. Because sometimes this happens, you get a strep pyogenes infection in the throat, you don't get it treated, and bacteria migrate from there and they set up residence in your heart valves, and then you get scarlet fever. So it's the same organism, but it moves to a new location. That's called focal. Focal infection. And then if you have the microbe all over the body in multiple locations, not just one or two. So you've got it here, here, everywhere. Your liver, all over the place. We call that a systemic infection. There we go, systemic. So that's where we have the microbe is widespread. At multiple body locations. That's systemic. And then we also could define superficial. Superficial infection is one that remains near the surface layers, and it is not deep to the body. So if you get a cut or a scratch, and you have an infection right there on the surface, it would be both local, if it doesn't spread, and if it doesn't migrate down into the deeper tissues, it would also be superficial. So those are location based. Make a note that this slide and these definitions are location based. definitions. And we have another gingerbread man outline to draw some different definitions on the next slide. I just wanted to get them separate so you have enough room to write. These are the ones based on location. And these next set are more based on the microbes' order and identity. All these order / identity based definitions. And the first of these definitions is what we call the primary infection. Primary, every infection that exists would be classified as primary because it refers to, okay, so you have this one infection that happened first. And we're going to use as an example of the primary infection, the same one that your book does, which is urinary tract infection. It's a good example. A urinary tract infection, which is in the bladder. I'm going to draw, oh gosh, it's a great bladder. There we go. You have a UTI at the bladder. That's the primary infection. And maybe that infection is just caused by one microbe, but it's possible it could be caused by two at once. So if an infection is caused by two microbes at once, we call that mixed infection. Where you have at least two microbes infecting the same location. One common source of a mixed infection is bites. This is a dog. Angry. Bites a person. It has a multiple array of microbes in its saliva. And if the person does not clean the wound or get it treated, they might have a mixed infection at that place.
Okay, isn't it correct that human bots are more likely to become infected than animal bots?
Yes, that is true. Human, like, I don't know if people are honest about, they come into the ER and they got a bite on them, that it comes from a person. Like if you have a large experience with bites, you can look at the teeth marks and tell person versus dog. But because people eat a more varied diet, we have more mouth microbes than dogs, and human bites are more likely to get serious complications than animal bites if it's not venom, like from a snake or something like that.
Somebody osteomyelitis, it turned into cellulitis, then osteomyelitis.
From a bite?
A human bite. Not bit.
I mean, that could also be because the type of people that bite each other and get bitten by each other are less responsible to clean wounds and stuff, but I really can't address that. But human bites tend to go bad more than animal bites. That is true.
They got dangerous.
They got what? Gangrenous?
Yeah.
Yes. So likely to lead to mixed infections. Then you're trying to treat multiple things at once, which is not easy. That does not look like a dog, but there. It looks like an alien or something. But mixed infections have more than one thing at the same time, and that can cause a lot of complications in treatment and diagnosis and prognosis. Then the other type of infection that's really common in healthcare settings is something called secondary infection. And this one is the hardest to define and to make sense of. So a secondary infection happens when a new microbe establishes infection as a result of the primary infection. With a separate microbe. And I'm going to give two examples of this, because this is a harder concept to understand. So secondary infection means that because you had this other infection first, it caused the second infection. So one example is someone has a UTI, a bladder infection, and then they have antibiotics to treat that. So this would be the treatment, or ABX, antibiotics. And that kills the UTI microbe. But the antibiotics also affect the microbial flora that live in the vagina. There we go. And the outcome of this is that now there is a yeast overgrowth. And that could be in the vagina. It actually could be other places besides that. But if you give a person a drug that kills microbes generally all over the body, it upsets the balance of the flora, and then they tend to get secondary infection, which a lot of times is a yeast infection. And that is so unfair. And it happens more in women because of their bladder anatomy. But I love how OpenStax addressed this in the reading or the box or whatever that describe exactly how this happened. Like the patient, you give them a drug, they come back and they say, it's not working, I still have this problem. What they actually have is a totally separate problem. It's no longer a bladder problem, it is vaginal yeast infection. And then they need a different drug for that, and it just turns into like, this is so unfair. It's a secondary infection. The other time that this tends to happen is when people have lung infections. So, lovely, lung infection. They have a virus is the primary. A viral lung infection, and that increases mucus in the person, and they're having a more mucousy environment in the lungs, and then a secondary bacterial infection. It can go the other way too, that you have bacterial infection in the lungs and you get all this mucus and then get a viral infection, but it tends to be the other direction. Secondary infections are not the same as local focal. Those are the same thing moving places. Those are the same thing moving between places. A secondary infection has to be a separate microbe that was established in the body because there was a first infection with the original microbe. So has to be a completely new microbe, but the reason they got that infection was as a result of the primary infection. On your next exam, which is not for a while, the way I test this stuff is I give you all scenarios. Like, here's a disease scenario, and here is a word bank of all the different types of ways that you could describe this, and you pick out Which of these terms describe this scenario? Because that's so much better than like writing definitions of all this stuff. It's scenario based, and I think there's some practice questions that are available. Okay. So during the infection, the level of damage is going to be different based on different microbes that infect. But to complete the infection cycle, the microbe has to leave the body and then go and infect a new person. And this is called transmission stage. So this is the last of the 5 stages. How is it transmitted to a new host? So leave the host through a specific portal of exit. And thus transmit to a new person or new host. Transmission stage. Most of the portals of exit are the same as the portals of entry, really. And you can think of this as like, what are the parts of a person or the areas on a person that can be infectious? And some of them are kind of more obvious than others. Or we can think of this as, what are the ways that a disease leaves one person and makes it to the new person? And certain diseases move certain ways. So certain diseases, it has to be insect transmitted. And there's a few that can be transmitted through urine. There's several that can be transmitted through genital secretions. Some are bloodborne. Some are saliva based, like bites, people biting each other. Not so many from tears, but what's a tear transmitted disease? Comes out of one person's eye and it goes to the other person. Pink eye. It's not the only one, but it's the most common. Eye to eye. You can also get pink eye, feces to eye, which is how some little kids get it. Feces is a common portal of exit, but that's the transmission stage. So I knew we would not get through all these slides today, but we will continue with these on Monday. And it's possible, I think it's probable that we won't have new slides for Monday. We'll finish these and have, get your parasite assignments Monday and move on from there. And we'll get to talking about microbial flora Monday also. So that also means there's no new reading or quiz for Monday. See you then.
How's the weekend?
You too.